welcome everybody. My name's Lisa Hallgarten. I'm Head of Policy and Public Affairs at Brook, the Young People's Sexual Health Organisation, and I want to welcome you all to this webinar today, focusing on the issue of consent for boys and young men. We're holding this webinar as part of Sexual Health Week 2021, and this year we've got a focus specifically on consent, which felt like the right thing to do this year. Enthusiastic consent is a foundation of healthy, enjoyable relationships, and is a thread that runs through all of Brook's work and always has been. But this year's events, with things like Everyone's Invited and the overwhelming response of people invited to tell their stories about sexual abuse and harassment and even sexual assault in schools, has made this feel really an acute thing. It's something that people's attention is focused on this year, and something we really wanted to sort of pull apart. So the harms, the difficulties, and also the positives of talking about consent with young people. The education team members have talked to us about people in schools finding this sometimes a tricky subject to address, and they have concerns specifically about addressing it with young men. How do we ensure that we don't sidestep the truths about and the statistics about sexual harassment, which is that overwhelmingly it's boys and young men who are perpetrators and girls and women who are victims, without the risk of disengaging those boys and young men, without the risk of targeting and labelling all young men in the same way. So how do we do that constructively? And these are all things that teachers struggle with, but we know that there's lots of people doing really excellent work around this in this field, and we've got some of you here today, so it's a massive privilege to have the panel we've got to discuss this. I want to introduce you all, and just to let everybody who's participating know that we're going to start with a conversation between me and the panellists. If you've got things that you'd like to ask a specific panellist or in general, do put a question in the Q&A. We're expecting lots and lots of questions, so I can't guarantee everything will be answered, but we will make time at the end to have a look through those questions and try and answer as many of them as possible. So before we dig into the sort of the substance of this, I'd like to ask people in turn to introduce themselves, say a little bit about what they do in their organisation in general, and specifically how that relates to the subject of boys, young men and consent. And I'm going to start by introducing Susie McDonald, who is the Chief Executive of Tender, which is an organisation that uses theatre-based education to tackle abuse, violence, and to help children and young people to better understand healthy relationships. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your organisation and what you do?
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I'll be delighted. Yeah, so for about 17 or 18 years now, we've been working with schools and youth settings as well, to work with children and young people to explore the issues of healthy and unhealthy relationships. And our sole premise for existing, and our sole mission, is to prevent domestic abuse and sexual violence from happening in the first place. So we always want to work with young people to explore their understanding and increase their ability to understand and have knowledge and a language to be able to talk about healthy and unhealthy behaviours, in order that as they form more entrenched friendships or they begin to explore romantic relationships, then they can consider what those components are and feel equipped with a language to be able to talk about that. That's why we use drama and theatre as a way of doing that, so that they can rehearse techniques for managing different situations and explore how some things might work out, not just hypothetically, but actually if they practice those. And they can consider other people's characters and scenarios rather than drawing on their own experiences. I think the important thing to say is that Tender takes a gendered approach to domestic abuse. So as Lisa says, we can't sidestep the issue that most perpetrators are men and boys, and most victims will be girls and women. But our starting point is that we believe that violence and abuse in any relationship is unacceptable, regardless of who's perpetrating it or who's experiencing it. And we really welcome and want to engage with boys and young men in those conversations, to make sure that they can feel that they're allies in making sure those things are called out, rather than feeling that they're being judged or blamed or branded as something that actually most of them don't want to be. I think that's enough from me.
Thank you, Susie. And next I'm going to introduce Ben Hurst, who is the head of facilitation at Beyond Equality, and it's an organisation that engages with boys and young men to rethink masculinity, create gender equality and prevent gender-based violence. Please tell us a bit more about what you do.
You stole my my elevator pitch. That's like that's the best introduction, and I always use it, and I can't use it, so I don't know what to say. Hello everyone, my name is Ben. So I work for Beyond Equality, and as Lisa said, we work in schools, universities and corporate spaces, and our aim is really to engage men and boys in gender equality conversations, particularly through the lens of masculinity. So we employ a bunch of different methods to do that, but essentially what we do is have conversations and try to bring boys and men into spaces where they feel comfortable and safe to have those kinds of conversations, where they can ask like the stupid questions, they can explore all of the things that are really problematic and really harmful, and try to draw better conclusions. And I think the approach of our organization is one that's not like super prescriptive. It's a lot to do with exploration, and then lots of little pieces of education slipped in there kind of covertly. So we try to hold those spaces for men to have those conversations, and I think that's really important, in part because I think men are used to being told what the right answers are. And I think men are also used to getting it wrong. So I think those two things going together don't really lead to good outcomes. So we try to be the kind of middle piece in that conversation. And another big part of that is that we work with men. So we have male facilitators who go into these spaces and work with the boys. And I'm sure a lot of the reasoning for that will come up a little bit later, but that's a brief introduction.
Thank you, that's brilliant, Ben, thank you. Nick, so Nick's my colleague, he's head of business development at Brook and one of our most experienced teachers, workshop facilitators and trainers, delivering RSE in the classroom and lots of training for teachers and professionals. But you might want to say a little bit more about that and how that relates to this topic.
You've also stole my elevator pitch, Lee. Yeah, so my background is in youth work, started off around 20 years ago now, and then moving into the counselling realm, working with all young people, but sort of by default, a lot of my work has been with boys and young men over the years. I've worked with Brook for about 8 years now, and I've had various roles, mainly within the education, the clinical teams, because Brook offer both clinical and education schools across the sort of across the board. And yeah, my work now is to lead on the development of our resources to make sure that they're young people informed, they're informed by all genders, all sexualities, and that they are really relevant to the young people that we're working with in schools, and also ensuring that the resources are reaching people that aren't necessarily within the mainstream education field as well. So it isn't just in schools, it's youth centres, detached settings, or wherever young people may be. I am within the education team. I think out of about 70 of us, there's 2 or 3 men. So by default, I tend to pick up a lot of the boys and young men's work. It's an area of interest for me, but also I have a lot of experience by default because I am one of the few men within the sexual health realm of Brook. So I've got a lot of experience, in particular the experiences of teaching and educating boys and young men within schools around consent in particular.
Thank you, Nick. And that raises really interesting questions that might kind of emerge as we go on about why this is seen as the kind of relationships realm is seen as a realm that's more interesting to women professionals than to men professionals. So that in and of itself is probably another webinar.
Yeah, and if we can get more boys and young men to come forward and work with us, we'll be more than happy to take them. So this might be a recruitment drive as well as a webinar. So who knows?
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. Toby Hollins is one of Brook's champions. I've known Toby since about 2016, I think, when he first joined the kind of advocacy and campaigning for mandatory RSE. So that's been a win because we've had that since, well, really coming in properly this term as a mandatory topic in all schools in England. And we also work together to lobby the Department for Education around what should be in the education guidance. Toby, I think you don't have an organisation to represent, you're a university student. It'd be really interesting to kick off this discussion really with you telling us a little bit about what you did and didn't learn about consent at school, what you think could have been done differently, and as a university student, how this issue is being raised. Is it being raised, and is it being addressed?
Yeah, I can kick off, but yeah, Lisa's again stolen my line. That is exactly accurate. Started working with Brook and sort of lobbying for RSE, sort of working alongside them, being a spokesperson for of what I felt was missing from RSE, what was there, what needed tweaking, needed improving, the big gaps, small gaps that needed filling. But yeah, if I could kick off straight away, so sort of in school, I went to a relatively small like Church of England secondary school in southeast London. So in terms of RSE, a lot of it was done sort of more broadly. A lot of it was done was through biology lessons. It was quite clinical, but as a school, maybe because of funding resources, it normally tended with things like consent or online relationships or relationships in general, it tended to outsource things and have like other people brought in. Like I remember particularly, maybe it's because of going in an inner city school, we had lots of focus from very early on and sort of throughout about like gangs, knife crime, things. And that was sort of something that I sort of later on noticed was obviously very useful to me and lots of people around me. But later on sort of noticed, that's something that only, statistically speaking across sort of me, my friendship group, the school, the area, the UK as a whole, that only certain people are sort of brush against. Whereas things like I sort of realized consent and sex and relationships was given much less of a focus. Sort of in particular, I had one specific sort of relationships lesson where we were sort of given a script of this, sort of told this story of two people, boy and a girl, and sort of brought up questions about, what is right and wrong, or what is, how relationships can play out, how they can be difficult, how they can be good, sort of from that. So that was my sort of quite succinct RSE consent in schools. And then again, it's a sixth form with a much bigger group of people. I was in a sixth form of about 400 or 500. Again, I thought they did like at this age, sort of 16, 17, when people are more likely to be getting into relationships, I thought the sex ed was done quite well. I mean, they were a bit stretched for resources, it was very hard, but they outsourced, a really like confident like group of people to come in and talk to us about STIs, consent, protection, pregnancies, contraception, all things like that. But in terms of consent specifically, we did have one specific assembly, but again, I think if memory serves me well, that wasn't something that was the school broached themselves. It wasn't something they put on themselves. I think a former student said, oh, I'd really like to do this. So they brought like her in, she was sort of just graduated, came in and did a very short assembly about it. So I think, yeah, like you said, the university seems to be the time where it comes up a lot more specifically. So at my university, the first event of Freshers Week is you sort of arrive, you move in, you wave goodbye to mum and dad, and the first thing that you get is a consent workshop, which focuses specifically, and it's much more directly addressed, whereas to sort of even over the gaps of people coming, particularly, I mean, for UK students, obviously having various degrees, but I think the group of international students in particular find it the most useful to sort of start the sort of, moving out of home and starting your own life, all on sort of a relatively equal playing field in terms of knowledge, understanding, and where everyone sort of has a vague or hopefully most specific understanding of what consent is and how it's healthy and necessary for relationships going forward, and sort of as you're bridging the gap from school into adulthood. Right, I think that's my little spiel.
Thank you. And it's really good for us to hear that universities are, and we know we're being commissioned by universities to do this kind of work, but also shocking to find out how many people get to the point of being at university without ever having had any discussion whatsoever about consent, at a point where they're kind of transitioning into adult life and social lives, where they're going to encounter sexual relationships and romantic relationships. Thank you, Toby. I said in the introduction that we quite often asked by schools, what's the best way to approach this? And people think it's a particularly difficult subject to approach with boys. And I really wanted to talk to Nick a little bit about, from a school's perspective, what they think the specific challenges are. What are they worried about? And then I'll follow that up with finding a bit more about how we can overcome those challenges.
Sure, yeah. I think there's various reasons that come through from schools around how they see it to be a challenge to engage boys and young men around the sort of conversations with consent. I think when you're sort of looking at it with, it's the boys and young men that are hard to engage, actually it's the wrong way of looking at it. A lot of the time it's the skill of the teacher or the facilitator that needs to adapt to meet the way that the boys and young men's learning styles may be different to the other types of subjects that they're doing at school. I mean, we know girls and young women tend to come through sexual health services a lot earlier. They are talking about contraception in clinic at 13 or 14. And the first time we see a lot of boys and young men through our clinical services is when there's an STI. Other than that, there isn't any real conversations happening with them around their sexuality, their sex lives, their enjoyment within their sex lives, and the sort of the consent conversations where girls and young women may have got those messages a little bit earlier on. I've known schools sort of asked me to come in at year 11 and do a quick half-an-hour assembly at the end of the school year on consent, and actually that should have been built in, you know, really from primary school working right through the sort of secondary years. A half-an-hour assembly, better than nothing, but actually it's not enough time to explore all the nuances and all the different sort of angles that we need to be looking at when we're talking about consent, in particular with the way that boys and young men are viewing it. So I think sometimes, and I do totally appreciate the schools' time constraints are difficult with the curriculum in general, but time does need to be given to talking to boys and young men around the subject right from sort of year 7s, even before, so that when they're going into, like Toby just mentioned around going to uni, and yeah, it's great that we're having those talks at uni where there's, you know, people are maybe exploring their sexuality more, but the sort of conversations around consent really should be embedded a lot earlier. So a lot of the time I spend is talking to teachers around how they can bring those conversations in earlier, but also the skill and how to reach those boys and young men in different ways, and ensuring the conversations are inclusive and they're not coming across as, right, we need you to come in, and I've had this from a school, I need you to come in and talk to the boys so that they aren't sexually assaulting or raping girls, and that message, that tone, if you're leading with that tone, the boys and young men are just going to disengage straight away. They're just not going to be there with you. So we try and frame it around ensuring that when we're coming in to have that sort of education, that session, it is really geared in pleasure, happiness, enjoyment, excitement within the relationship, and then exploring the laws and the sort of the more of the abusive side that comes with not having consent as those conversations progress.
That's really interesting. So sort of turning the conventional discussion a little bit on its head, because we normally lead with harm, don't we? And then we reluctantly talk about pleasure because that feels difficult, but turning that on its head as a way of engaging boys and young men more, I think is something to really think about. Does anyone have any? Sorry, Nick.
So I think that can happen in other areas of sexual health. You're talking about STIs, it's don't do this because you'll do this. It's always coming from the negative angle, but actually the way, and I'm sure others around the panel gear their lessons in the same way, that, you know, leading with the messages around sort of pleasure and happiness, and that your sex lives should be fun, it should be great, it should be a good time, but also bringing in those key messages around the importance of, if you're not having consent, this is a really big issue, and how the law affects you, but also the ethical sides of consent as well. So it's kind of the way that I lead whenever I'm training or educating within schools.
Thanks, Nick. Susie, I was
just going to follow up on both the points that Toby and Nick made around the idea of, if something's a one-off, then it's never going to be enough. And I think in terms of the way that the new RSE curriculum is perhaps addressed by schools, because they're so pressured for trying to make sure that things fit within that school day, that ideas like consent can be pushed into a pigeonhole that's then very, very difficult and quite alarming to address. So I have seen some teachers who, with the best will in the world, start conversations or lessons about consent by talking about a definition of rape, the word rape is alarming in itself, and then the definition is even more uncomfortable, both for the teacher then to be able to present that conversation or start that conversation, and for the students to be hearing it. And it doesn't always then address the idea that actually rape can happen in existing relationships. It's not strangers jumping out of bushes. So I think it's taking steps back and saying this is an ongoing conversation. Back to Nick's point, you start it in primary school around friendships and what you want from friendships. Then you begin to explore how the joy that you have in your friendships can then be transferred into more sexualized relationships or intimate relationships where there might be romance. So it's enabling schools to sort of see the journey of that conversation rather than going, okay, we're just going to do consent in year 9 because that's when they start being sexually active. That would be a point that I would like to make.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Susie. Ben.
Yeah, I was just going to add really good points from everyone, and I think that there's this element of like consent that I think we just assume. Like I think as like adults who like have fully functioning adult brains and like have experienced a wealth of life, we kind of assume that kids just should understand this idea. But I think there's also this piece that's like, there are loads of kids who haven't maybe grown up in environments where consent is a thing that's modeled to them. So they don't necessarily have an experience of it. They don't necessarily understand the way that it's supposed to feel or the way that it's supposed to work. And then add into that on the gendered level, I think like the way that masculinity works in our society means that actually consent is like completely countercultural to like most kids, to most boys. And it's not something that's ever modeled to them as something that they should understand or seek from another person. Actually, like what they learn about masculinity is that they're supposed to be dominant, they're supposed to be the leader, they're supposed to make the decisions, people are meant to follow them. And like I remember like being a kid and watching like Looney Tunes and watching like Pepe Le Pew chase around the other female skunk and being like, this is a bit weird, but okay, that's obviously what boys are supposed to do. And like James Bond and all of these media references and music and culture, like everything is saying to these kids like, this is the way that you're supposed to behave. You're supposed to pursue people even when they say no. People need to be won over. And then like school is a weird environment as well, right? Like, and I know there's loads of teachers on the call right now. And like, there's these kind of ideas of not being able to go to the toilet or like having to get permission for all of these things, maybe not feeling like your ability to say no to things that you don't want to experience is fully actualized. So then not being able to make sense of how that should work between you and other people. And I think that's just like a really confusing soup to like grow up in, which leads to this experience where I think a lot of boys maybe kind of slip through the nets because they haven't perpetrated. So they haven't done something that's like we consider bad, so they're fine. As opposed to, and then we look at the boys who have perpetrated as like, oh, these are bad kids, as opposed to like everybody's been raised in the same way and they've all got this cultural script that tells them that they're not supposed to ask or seek permission from other people. And I think maybe that's like almost like consent is kind of a symptom of a deeper root issue, I think especially for boys. So I think like trying to tackle what that thing is that lies underneath it, for us we find is like a really useful way of diving into that conversation.
Nick?
No, I think that's a really good point, Ben. And actually just to build on that, whenever I'm doing any sort of one-to-one counselling work with survivors of sexual assault who are boys and young men, it always links back to the masculinity in what is hindering them in coming forwards, because of this notion of consent being something that can't necessarily happen to a man. If it does, then regardless of your sexuality, you're viewed as gay, or you're viewed as weak, or you're viewed as not being masculine enough. And that can be a real hurdle with any sort of exploitation, sexual abuse that boys and young men are experiencing, in even opening up and coming forward for support. And then when gaining the support, actually being open to that, because they feel this sort of masculinity that's been built into them from a very young age. You know, from when a boy falls over when they're little, get up, be a man up, all of that is sort of flowing through. And I've really seen the effects of that when boys and young men have been victims and survivors of sexual assault, in how they gain that support and also how how they cope with that trauma going forwards in their life. So just to build on your point there, Ben, I do agree. And I think that is something that needs to be challenged right from the conversations around consent, but also schools and education, and all of us as educators need to have that open environment where boys and young men can feel comfortable coming forward to talk about those experiences, regardless of how masculinity is being viewed. You unmute still, Lisa.
I was really interested, Ben, as well, in what you were saying about that kind of whole school environment in which there's limited scope for people to have agency. So there's limited scope for people to express their needs and desires and to have those respected. And obviously that's a huge conundrum for schools because they're often managing, you know, a through flow of 1,500 children, and it could be complete anarchy. But then there might be things to think about within schools about what more we can do to ask for and to give and expect to have those conversations around consent, around some of the just daily interactions between children and between teachers. And I suppose that's just a really huge topic that we could sort of take away and think more about. And I mean, you jumped my gun again, Ben, there with the question, because the question I was going to ask you was about why you take this focus on rethinking masculinity. And you and Nick have both already said some really useful things about some of the kind of harmful messages that people get in the kind of construction of their masculinity. And I wonder if you could tell us a tiny bit about what Beyond Equality does to unpick that and to reframe that in more positive ways.
Yeah, so thank you. It's a really good question. I think for us at Beyond Equality, what we aim to do, like I said before, is open up spaces for conversation. I know that like opening spaces for conversation is such like a buzzword phrase, like a catchphrase that people throw around, but I think it like really, really is important. And in part because generally, I think one assumption that's really safe to make is that most people want to be good people, right? Like given the opportunity, most people want to have at least the self-perception of themselves as a good person. And therefore, like safe to assume that most kids in the classroom want to get the answer right, like want to know that be the person that's doing well or whatever it is. And when you give kids like the space to ask questions or to figure stuff out or think things through, what we tend to find is that they arrive at really healthy and good conclusions by themselves. Sometimes they need a little bit of guidance, like sometimes they might need to be challenged or asked a question or interrogated about something they think or they believe. But I know from like my own experience as a kid, being told what was the right or the wrong answer didn't really work for me. And I remember at school, like my favorite lesson being RE, because that was the lesson where we got to like debate and we got to like think about things and ask questions and argue and have it out and figure out what we thought. And so I think we try to create spaces like that for the boys, where they're allowed to like get it wrong. They're allowed to ask questions. They're allowed to say silly things. They're not going to get in trouble. There's no consequence. But the end goal of that is to move them to a space where they're starting to interrogate their views. Like, again, for me, in my experience, I didn't really learn like critical analysis skills until I was like well into university, maybe my third year. And so when I was in school, like I didn't have the ability to like access media and then analyze it, like critique what was going on, whether I agreed with it or not. And so creating those spaces, I think helps really the boys develop those kinds of skills, not just for that moment or that like 1 hour workshop or 2 hour workshop where we're in the school, but also leaving that space to continue to ask those questions and continue to dive into those difficult conversations.
That's really interesting. And it made me wonder, Susie, about, there's a lot of debate, isn't there? There's obviously a real value in doing that work with boys and young men. And there's often a debate about whether it's better to talk about sex education and relationship issues within a kind of co-ed setting or a single sex setting. Obviously, we often don't get a choice about that. That's whatever the school is. But I'm quite interested in finding out, in terms of the work that Tender does, how does working through a kind of drama technique help with bringing together boys and girls to talk about this?
Yeah.
And what's the sort of impact of drama on on their ability to see each other's perspectives or to communicate with each other?
Yeah. I mean, I think so. There's a few things that I would say. So what we found very early on in the workshops that we were running, where it was a mixed group, was that boys withdrew, not noticeably, but they became slightly quieter. And we evaluate everything we do with questionnaires, and we could see that we weren't having quite the impact on, say, a change in attitude or knowledge with the boys in a group compared to with the girls. And girls were often a lot more vocal in the sessions. So we've worked really hard to ensure that we're creating a space where boys feel equal participants in the conversation. I mean, I think it's really interesting what Ben says, because we're obviously organisations that are doing the same thing, that we're creating a space in which young people can draw conclusions, because that experiential learning, which is what theatre allows them to do, creates long-term memory of change and enables them to feel that they've made those decisions. Having said that, there are conclusions that they need to draw. So they need to understand that violence or abuse is never acceptable, that there are no excuses for behaving inappropriately, whether it's pushing somebody into having sex or coercing them into behaving in certain ways. So there does come a point in any program of work in which you have to be very clear about these are the things that are right and these are the things that are wrong. And it doesn't matter whether you're a boy or a girl or transgender, you know, or your gender, your binary. It doesn't matter who you are in that relationship. You have a responsibility to engage with other people in a really healthy way and to be treated well as well. And so I think drama is really useful to enable people to play. And when they start playing, they become more themselves rather than the student who's sort of keeping an eye on their own credibility, I guess. And we're not asking them to be silly, but by playing, they become more able to be open to conversations then. And we don't step in with the premise that we're looking at this as a gendered issue, that we're not starting by saying, you know, the majority of perpetrators may be boys and the majority of victims may be girls, because from our own experience, we found that doesn't work, because actually the girls get really angry at the idea that they may be victims, that they're more likely to be a victim than they are to be a perpetrator. So we allow, through the exploration of statistics and scenes where you can play around with the gender of characters, what feels most real to them. And then we've got the evidence of the statistics to say, actually, this is the number of women who will experience something, the number of men who will experience something. So they can begin to explore that with evidence underneath the playfulness. And I think that's what works well for us. Yeah, I think that's, I'll stop there before I rant.
And one of the things that I was sort of wondering, that there clearly will be intersecting identities that impact on the issue of consent for boys and young men, and that might be an intersection with homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, racism, ableism. And you kind of referenced that a bit, Susie, in the way that you work, in a way that primarily is about individual relationships with each other, which should be able to be transferred to any form of relationship. But I just wondered if Nick could say a bit more about that, because there's a huge kind of, one of the very positive things about the RSHE guidance that came from the government was that when we're talking about, for example, LGBT plus people or disabled young people, that these shouldn't be kind of self-contained one-off lessons, that our whole programme has to be threaded through with inclusion and material that's relevant to all young people. And I just wondered, in terms of consent, what does inclusive RSE look like from a kind of Brook point of view?
Yeah, so I think in the past, those that have engaged in RSE before it was mandatory, and let's be honest, a lot of schools did and do before the guidance came in, and not taking that away from schools. There was a lot of good education happening and really high quality, but the LGBT plus lessons tended to be a bolt-on. So it was, you had your RSE curriculum, you had your lessons around consent, sexual health, so on, And then you might have an LGBT plus lesson on terminology. If I'm honest with you, most young people know terminology better than us, even as educators in sexual health. And actually what LGBT plus people are telling us, they want to know around how does consent look within LGBT relationships? How about things such as sexual practices such as preparing for sex, preparing for anal sex, douching? How does it look to have a partner that is non-binary or within a different setting than the heteronormative boy and girl? And all those parts of sex education that aren't coming through, because even with the guidance is saying it should be intertwined now and moved through, but it does still feel quite heteronormative in areas. And I think the conversations around consent can still be quite heteronormative. Don't do this as a boy because this will happen to a girl. And actually, I had a conversation recently with two gay men who were saying, one of the gay men was telling me that he doesn't want to bottom in that relationship, but he feels he has to because he's younger, he's slimmer, and he feels like his partner's older. So he has to take the role as being the bottom and the other person at the top. And actually, if he's not comfortable with that relationship and he's fitting in within that stigma just because he feels that that's what's expected of him, that's not consensual. He's not happy with that, and that isn't a pleasurable relationship for him. But he didn't see it as being non-consensual because no one's ever had those conversations around consent in the absence of touching or raping or sexual assault, but actually looking at what you're enjoying, how you're excited by that sexual activity, and how that looks for you in your relationship. So probably even me saying that and using that language there can be quite uncomfortable for some people to talk about, but actually we need to get better at talking to young people at the level that they need. And we've done a recent poll with LGBT plus young people that have left school into universities and don't really have much of a clue beyond that sort of egg and sperm, man and woman, penis and vagina. And actually all of us need to get better at having those conversations and being more inclusive, whether it's consent or whether it's sexual health in general.
And I think it's really interesting that you say that young people maybe have a better grasp on kind of emerging terminology and ideas and sort of maybe more inclusive, broader ideas about what relationships can look like. And I just wondered, Toby, whether you think that is something that is just at the level of kind of terminology, or are young people really much more aware of thinking about consent and thinking about all aspects of sexual relationships as things that are really based on are really interpersonal, regardless of the people who are in them? What are those sort of conversations being had amongst young people in universities, or is the kind of like, if you like, the inclusiveness sort of at the level solely of terminology? Do you think people are still thinking in kind of quite heteronormative and cisnormative terms when they're discussing relationships, especially in relation to things like consent? Sorry, that was a bit of a rambling question. Does that make sense to you?
Yes. Okay, I'm going to start with the terminology bit.
Yeah.
I would say that definitely, as opposed to, the younger generations, as they keep coming through, will always be more tech savvy than the people, the educators, the adults in the room. So they were much more likely to have grasp of, not necessarily, people will have, I reckon throughout all of my sort of RSE, people always had heard of the words before, sort of even like words that we consider maybe now more like quite normal and frequently used, like bisexual, but things like non-binary, or even more, or young people feel more comfortable using those words because they read them on Twitter, on blogs, on Instagram. They crop up all the time in sort of TMZ news articles, celebrity gossip. Can you repeat the second half of that question? Because it felt like it was in two parts.
It was in a million parts, sorry. I suppose I was taking it as a given what you're saying, really, which is that young people are much more comfortable with kind of emerging terminologies around difference and inclusion, and it was more about whether that makes its way into conversations around things like consent and around the way sort of power within relationships. So are a lot of young people still thinking in terms of men as perpetrators and women as potential victims, or are people thinking much more broadly and thinking much more in terms of that particular interpersonal relationship, and that whatever that relationship is, whoever it's between, that those issues of power and those issues of consent are still really, really important and relevant?
I think I would say it's less viewed as, or in terms of across, sort of groups like male to female, or people are aware that relationships are looking quite different, and they're not sort of, you meet your school age sweetheart, who sits the girl who sits behind you in maths, that's completely out the window. People, as relationships, the way they look are changing, and people understand, what used to be sort of man, breadwinner, woman, the submissive, stay at home, those ideas are still prevalent, but they are much more translatable. So I guess young people can understand them more, and are sort of more willing to talk about them in more open group settings. But I think in terms of, you mentioned sort of perpetrators and victims, and Susie, I think Susie, Nick, and Ben, we've all spoken about sort of leading with those statistics. Something that I sort of, looking back on school, with particularly with things not being threaded through, when you have like bolt-on specific lessons, when you start to talk about perpetrators or who's, power dynamics and what's right or wrong, sort of boys, it always becomes two camps. People sort of claw back and become less open because they feel sort of more observed, which sort of coming to what Ben was saying about masculinity, that I think young people have definitely like far more quick learning ability to be able to speak about power dynamics and who's, consent and what that can look like, but they're a bit like apprehensive of getting it wrong. So when you put it in an education setting, like Ben was saying, the structure of schools, sort of, can I go to the toilet? Is this right or wrong? Particularly with, especially with the hammering down of like exam pressures as you get further through schools, it's so much more about right or wrong, that it's less the feeling you can teach it. I reckon young people probably able to pick it up quicker because it's more, society is progressing faster and they have access to that on the internet. They go home and watch it on, Hollyoaks. But there's an absence, a concept of getting it wrong, which I feel, needs addressing, which is why I think threading it through would definitely play an important role in that, which is good that that's in the RSE curriculum, but whether schools have the time to address that properly rather than just sort of doing the whole RSE, but bit by bit. Does that make sense if I answered your question?
It does make sense. I'm going to ask for Susie's response to that, and then I've got a couple of questions that have come through from people who are listening in. So we'll move to those questions afterwards. Susie.
Yeah, I think what Toby says is really useful around the power dynamic, because it then begins to cover, it takes away the kind of pressure to look at different types of relationship, whether they're heterosexual relationships, homosexual relationships, whatever, or whether they're for a day or whether they're long term. It's about the power dynamic within that relationship, within that interaction. And obviously a teacher's power dynamic with a student to tell them to tuck the shirt in and do their homework is a given, and that's a positive kind of power dynamic because you're creating a space in which they can learn. But in terms of a relationship, whether that's a friendship or an intimate relationship, if that power dynamic is, you can identify whether there's a problem by understanding what the power dynamic is. So through society, men have more power than women, and therefore that's why Tender comes from the gender perspective, because historically that has been the case. And I think lots and lots of things are changing at the moment. And that's not to say that all men feel or do have power, but they do have more power than women a lot of the time. And that's our perspective. But then we can also look at that power dynamic in terms of perhaps additional vulnerabilities or the intersectionality of certain experiences in terms of getting help or barriers to seeking help. So somebody with a disability is more vulnerable to experiences of domestic abuse and may have challenges in terms of accessing the right support for them. So it's really important for young people to be aware that the relationship will have added layers to it. So we go back to that notion of nuance, which Nick talked about, that if we talk about consent, it's in too sort of black and white a way. We're not addressing the nuances of the power dynamic Because if somebody says yes, even if they appear to be enthusiastic, is the power dynamic forcing them to say enthusiastically, yes, I want to have sex? How do you unpick that? And how does a teacher in a school who's telling you to tuck in your shirt feel confident to also have the conversation about nuanced relationships like that? It feels quite unfair on teachers, and I think being able to work with outside organisations like the ones we have here is a really important way to be able to enable schools to be that really brilliant place for young people to explore all those different nuances.
And that takes us really brilliantly actually to one of the questions that was asked, which is covering some of that same ground, Susie, which is somebody saying, I completely agree regarding masculinity. My question is, where are we going wrong as a society with this? Because schools do seem to do a lot. Something's happened to that question. It's just disappeared. But she was saying that schools do seem to do a lot, and young people do seem to give the right answers in the classroom, but how much can schools really do? And I think that's something to sort of think about, that schools, I think, feel very overwhelmed by the amount they have to do, but also, as you say, Susie, moving between different dynamics, from maintaining discipline or teaching very fact-based subjects to working on very a much more kind of nuanced interpersonal level. I've got the question back now. It says, where are we going wrong as a society? Children often know the right answers to give when talking about it, but deep core values don't seem to change fast enough. And to what degree can schools resolve this? So I think there's something about the scope and limitation of education to actually change societal values and to change the kind of culture in which people are growing up, which I think is a really legitimate question, and something very much related to it by the next question, which is that my experience is that school staff are reluctant to talk about sex in general, let alone start a conversation about consent. But what we should be advocating is a discussion at a very early age about permission seeking and giving, and this should be modelled by staff with children, and I don't see much evidence of this actually happening. We've got a couple more questions, but it'd be great to get Nick's thoughts on the scope and limitation of schools to do this work.
And thank you for that question, because that is a common, whenever I'm doing training with teachers, it is the common and the biggest sort of priority for them around, I'm a maths teacher, I came in to teach maths and now I'm being told to teach RSE. What the hell am I going to do? I don't even like saying the word vulva. I mean, and I've got to teach RSE. So, you know, we really embed the sort of try and embed that confidence to begin with around it's okay to say these words, and these words are okay, and you know, talking about sex is okay. But there's loads of resources. We've got loads on the website, and the other panelists here have got resources as well, which you can tap into to help with sort of building confidence around that. But just remember that you can't always know that you have the answers for everything, and there are experts that you can bring in to support with that process. And it is a gradual learning thing. I mean, I've done this job for 8 years, and some things I still go a bit like, oh God, right, okay, I'm going in there to talk about that. It's so, you know, there's always learning and there's always change, and don't be too hard on yourselves if mandatory RSE is coming in 2020 and you're automatically expected to be teaching a whole curriculum of RSE that it's my full-time job and I have to research daily because of changes. So just don't be too hard, but also it's great that you're considering that work, and also there's loads of resources and options out there for you to guide you through how to move it a little bit more quickly if that's what you're looking for.
Thanks, Nick. Ben?
Yeah, I was just gonna add to that first of all, shout out to all the teachers. You guys are amazing. Like you said, Nick, if you're like somebody who like loves geography and you went to university and studied geography, and you came out of university and you did another year of studying, and then another year of like practice and observation to be able to teach geography to kids, in no way did you sign up to like teach sex ed, and that's really tough. It's a really tough position to be in. But for those of us who are educators, teachers, parents, whatever we might be, people who work with young people and with children, we have like such an incredible privilege and also such a huge responsibility to like do this work, right? And I remember like training to teach sex ed, and I remember training to do this job that I'm doing now around masculinities, and just every time feeling like completely overwhelmed by the amount of information there is to know and to understand. But I think sometimes what is really important is that we frame this conversation a lot about like helping boys and helping other people, but actually some of the most important work here is like the work on ourselves and the help that this brings to us. Like I know that my life like really drastically changed in terms of like my relationships with other people and my relationship with myself once I started to understand these ideas and these concepts. And I know, Susie, you were talking about like power imbalances and the ideas of like privilege and power and all of those kinds of things. And I think to answer the question, like where we need to move to as a society is to the point where these things are not tick box exercises to like say that we've taken the kids through the steps, but also like things that we're internalizing for ourselves. Because I know like one of the things I think is really hard is like, how do we expect adults to teach kids about consent when maybe the adults don't know about consent themselves? How do we expect them? Like I remember not knowing, pretending to know how periods worked like when I started my sex education job, because I just thought I was supposed to know, but I'd never really like understood it. And all of those things like STIs, consent, pregnancy, whatever it might be, all of those topics are really hard topics, but understanding them is not just beneficial for the young people, it's also beneficial for us. And I think if we can start to reframe it like that, then maybe it will help make that transition a little bit easier, because it's always easier to teach things from a lived experience, right? Like if you really understand something, it's much easier to help somebody else understand it. And that's a process, like Nick said, like take time. It doesn't have to like be overnight. It's not like next year you've got to be perfect at it. But I think like that balance of like doing the work internally and doing the work in your own time and understanding it for your own benefit, and then working hand in hand with like professional organizations who have the training and the experience to do this work and the expertise to engage young people in those kinds of conversations in specific ways is like a really good two-pronged approach, I think.
That's really interesting. I know Susie wanted to come back on that, and just before she does, I wanted to acknowledge there's a lot of discussion going on in the Q&As about the suitability of teachers and schools to be even doing this work. People saying that actually, you know, some teachers don't even know what a vulva is or you know, basic information. So how do we expect them to do this really nuanced information? So this discussion has been sort of going on since the birth of time, really. But hopefully we're going to get there at a point soon because it has become mandatory. Somebody asked in the Q&As about really good resources for dealing with this. I'm going to be really cheeky and flag up a couple of Brook resources. We've got a new Brook Learn, which is free e-training for teachers. Look at brook.learn online, and we've also got new handouts around how to deal with sexual assault in schools. I know that that Beyond Equality and also Tender, please do look at their websites because they have resources and will be able to possibly offer a service to some schools. I don't know how universally that will be available around the country, but please look at their websites. Before we finish up, Susie had her hand up and I wanted to bring her in briefly. And also, I don't know, Toby, if you'll have a moment to answer this as well, but there's a big discussion about who's best to deliver RSE, and not only are schools expected to do it without any resource for bringing in outside people, they have to find that resource from elsewhere, but also from the government. There's a big, strong theme, which is that parents are the primary educators of their children, and I'm really interested to hear from a young person's point of view whether you think for most people that is a useful framing. I'm going to start very quickly with Susie. We've got a couple of minutes.
Okay, I'll just very quickly respond. So in answer to that, I suppose the challenge we've got with teaching consent sits within the problem of society in terms of the short memories that we have as a society in terms of understanding specifically sexual harassment in schools, actually. And so there was a government inquiry in 2017 into sexual harassment in schools, and the media was very shocked by it. And as a consequence of that, the relationships and sex education curriculum has become mandatory, which is great. But then when the Everyone's Invited website was brought to everyone's attention earlier in the year, everybody was shocked and surprised yet again by the sexual harassment that's present in schools. So it's been happening the whole time, and yet somehow the focus on those experiences just keeps being diverted. So unless there's proper attention paid to how to deal with this properly and to enable schools and teachers to feel really confident about dealing with it, or by partnering with experts from outside, it's going to become this just Groundhog Day of, oh, we're diverted. Oh, look at that. We had no idea that was happening. And I think pulling parents into those conversations, so taking a whole school approach to the work, looking at the culture of the school, bringing senior leadership into those conversations, students, governors and parents and families and carers is a really important next step.
Thank you, Susie. It really does feel like Groundhog Day for some of us who've been in this field for a very long time. While I ask Toby to answer a question about parents as the prime educators of their children and young people, I'm going to ask the rest of you just to think about one top tip that you would give to the people who are on this webinar about something to do with improving our education around consent for boys and young men. It might be something structural, it might be something topic-based. So have a think about your one top tip. And meanwhile, I'm going to ask Toby whether he thinks that for most of his peers, whether they're friends at school or at university or in your social circles, whether you feel that parents are the primary educators of their young people. Do young people want them to be? And if not, what exactly is their role?
Oh, that's again a big question, and one that has plagued this, particularly about discussions about making RSE mandatory. When I first sort of started or being involved with this, that's always been a big question from the start. But in terms of peers, I would say lots of people expect, or parents themselves are expected to be given, birthright. It's their job to talk to their children about consent and relationships and growing up and becoming an adult and all of those things under that umbrella. But I think from looking back at school, those conversations don't translate into RSE lessons. So often, I went to it was quite a diverse school, so all the conversations that parents were either having, or lack of conversations that parents were having with their children, it was very much kept in the home. So there's, the only real opportunity where what students were talking about with their parents, with their families, with their siblings at home, the only way that came out between young people, they were talking about to each other about that, or learning either mostly from each other, was in those RSE lessons. So even, I'd love to sit here and say that that's a great way that parents can always be the educators, but that is just not substantial for everyone. There'll always be, people in care homes, or students who, as parents, work full time and can't, don't have the financial resources. It's a very sort of, there are restrictions there, and school is the only place, the whole point, where people are on that same level playing field. So even though lots of parents feel quite, and students feel quite, parents feel quite strongly, students, often really enjoy the ability because they get to learn from each other. So I think that's, in terms of government policy and then changing things in what schools and even the culture of a school, particularly, I know some parents will always have something to say. I remember once my head teacher held up a condom in an assembly, and he got a letter and an email from one set of parents. But
so there's something about it really being it's got to be a collaboration. We can't rely on one place, one person, one
can't exactly.
Thank you, Toby. I'm going to ask, we've had a request in the questions for people to tell us their website addresses. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask all the panellists to give us their top tip, and also to give us their website address. Nick.
Mine's easy, brook.org.uk, and there's loads of information on there, and all the free courses we mentioned, the Brook e-learning courses are linked through the Brook website, but also through brook.learn.org.uk, I believe. My top tip would be set your ground rules right from the start. You may be in a maths classroom, you may be a maths teacher, but set that space separate from a normal maths lesson. You set the space as being safe, talk about what the ground rules are. The questions are going to be uncomfortable or awkward. You know, that young person shouldn't be kicked out of the class or told off for it. There needs to be that space for that open conversation, for you to challenge those views, but also for the young people in the class to challenge each other's views as well. So that'll be my top quick tip.
Thanks, Nick. I'm going to hurry you all along. Susie, what's your top tip?
Don't avoid addressing gender norms. Do address them and ask boys and girls what they feel is the role that they should be playing when you're having conversations about consent, because then you'll get to the heart of it. And how can you instill a culture that makes all young people feel active protagonists of healthy relationships? So be welcoming of all genders. www.tender.org.uk.
Thank you, Susie. Ben?
Our website is beyondequality.org. And I always really struggle with top tips, actually. Like I feel like I'm really bad at like thinking on the spot of like, this is something you can do. But what I would say is there's no silver bullet, right? Like if this was a conversation about any other topic that like maybe is taught in a school, nobody would be sitting here with the expectation that any of us would be able to come up with one thing you can do to be able to successfully teach another subject. So what I would say is invest in the education piece for yourself. And I know that's like a really time consuming thing. And I know it's like not super easy. I know it's not always cheap. But like find courses. There are free courses. You can come and do a course with us on masculinity. I'm sure there are courses elsewhere that you can do on consent and different topics. But really like invest in understanding that for yourself and exploring it for yourself before worrying about like doing the most amazing job of teaching it to the kids, because I think that's when we'll see real like societal and cultural change.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Ben. We're going to have to close up. It's really frustrating. This is a really big topic and we've had some really brilliant ideas and thoughts. I'm going to thank you all for your brilliant contributions. Nick, Ben, Toby, Susie. Thank you for everybody who's been listening in and for your really important questions. Please do look at our websites and do look at our resources and do think about what Ben said about thinking about yourself and your own training needs and your own thoughts and values around this first. That's the foundation of being able to do something well with other people. Thank you so much and happy Sexual Health Week.